Welcome to UB Theater Grad Chat from the University at Buffalo Graduate Program in Theater and Performance. I'm Sarah Bay-Cheng, and in these podcasts we'll be talking with faculty and students about the issues affecting graduate studies in theater, dance, and performance today. If you're listening live on Google Hangout, we can take your questions in real time, or feel free to contact us at any time with questions and topics for future shows. You can email me at ubgradchat@gmail.com. Join me now as we open up the latest session of Grad Chat. Okay, so that's my intro. And today I'm very happy to be chatting here today with Scott Magelssen from the University of Washington and the chair of the Joint Subcommittee on Non-Print Publishing for the Association for Theater and Higher Ed, ATHA, and the American Society for Theater Research, ASTER. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here.
So if you are watching or listening live, you are more than welcome to click in and send us your questions. We can see those as they appear. You can just type them in. But before we sort of open it up to the floor, I wanted to get Scott to say a little bit about the process of putting together this white paper, which, in the interest of full disclosure, I was a contributing member of, though by far, far from the most influential on this group. And so I was just hoping that, Scott, you would give us a sense that the paper. When did we do this? Like about a year ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. The whole process is not quite 2 years old. It was 2 years ago this coming summer that I was approached by Bob Shanke, who was the Vice President for Research and Publications with ATHE. And Bob had been engaged in conversation with the leadership at ATHA and had himself put together a panel on what was being called at the time non-print publication for the ATHA conference that year. And that was a panel that had a number of acquisitions editors from the major university and academic presses in our field. And out of that conversation, along with leadership in ATHA, Bob charged the Research and Publications Committee with continuing the conversation. And I would say, if I were to put a finger on kind of the tenor of that conversation, I think that at that point, some of the folks in theater and performance were feeling like there was a dilemma, that somehow regular traditional print publishing was in a bad way, that there were a decreasing number of print books that were coming out, mm-hmm. or the number of print books that were coming out by academic presses was not keeping up with the changing standards of tenure and promotion that scholars in theater and performance were being faced with, especially new emerging people who were expected to publish a book, and sometimes even 2 books, right, before getting tenure. Yeah, so
well, I mean, this is something that's been going on for, probably like close to almost over a decade now, right? And sort of crisis in academic publishing. I know the MLA has talked about this repeatedly and had panels and discussions about this. As you were sort of looking through this, and I know various folks kind of pulled their sources, is that something that you found as well as part of your investigations? I mean, is there the crisis that in theater and performance studies that was thought to be had other places?
Well, actually, what we found, and we pulled acquisitions editors, and we were in conversation with some of the major presses that do have catalogs in theater and performance. And what they told us was no, that was even though that's a very trenchant perception. In fact, academic presses are continuing to be very productive in theater and performance, and so there hasn't been this perceived downtick in publication. And in fact, the academic publishers, and we could talk more about this later, but academic publishers seem to be some of our best partners in moving toward non-print publishing and digital research. So I think that the first thing that the committee figured out for ourselves was that rather than starting from a point of panic or paranoia, that we were setting up this traditional print scholarship, which was slowly ossifying and fading away with the new kind of savior of academic scholarship, which is going to be digital publication. That binary quickly became dismantled, and instead, what we realized in doing some of this initial investigation was that digital scholarship allows for a kind of value-added way of going about scholarship. That by looking at ways to produce and disseminate knowledge outside the printed hard copy format, digital scholarship allows for a multiplicity of ways of learning about theater and performance, and so that then became the trajectory of our mission, and eventually of the recommendations we had in our white paper.
Well, certainly, I'm thinking about the University of Michigan Press and your and Henry's theaterhistoriography.org site, and the way that contributes really usefully to the book, Theater Historiography, right? Sort of, give me the official title.
Theater Historiography, Critical Interventions.
Right. Okay. So critical interventions, and then we get this wonderful website, and it's actually been pretty robust. There's been a lot of good conversations. I know I've gone to that. Are there other? And I mean, I think we can all point to kind of growing resources. I know we had been talking about Nancy Freeland at Columbia and the libraries. Certainly Doug Reside at CUNY, and a bunch of other folks. We had just had Matt Gold here talking about CUNY's Commons in a Box and some of their digital humanities in publishing initiatives. Are there other presses and things that they're doing in concert with this besides the University of Michigan?
Yes, a number of the academic presses, both university presses and the larger ones not connected with universities, are figuring out for themselves that digital publishing is really, really important. And that's not to say that they're switching their resources from print publishing to non-print publishing, but rather they are expanding their offerings, and they're deciding that as this change is taking place, they want to be the ones who are providing scholars those resources. And so Palgrave has their new Palgrave Pivot program, in
right.
which they focus on a quicker digital turnaround for sometimes shorter projects that aren't really conceived of as the traditional book monographs. And there are websites like the one that Henry and I run, and theaterhistoriography.org is I think a great hub for sharing scholarship. People can share their syllabi and their assignment prompts, and we regularly host guest bloggers who will talk about their scholarship, so there are sites like that are gathering places to find out what's going on out there in theater and performance studies. But then, in addition to those resources, there are great sites that are online that are where the good work of theater research is happening. And so I think of, for instance, Wendy Ahrens and Natalia Baldiga have put together this project that's funded with an NEH grant that is using crowdsourcing and open scholarship to translate G.E. Lessing's Hamburg dramaturgy. And so they've got the thing broken up into the essays, the various sections, and they're providing their translation and asking the people out there, hey, does this jibe with how you think about the way that these particular German phrases ought to be translated? And so that's an incredibly interesting resource. There are a couple of websites, web-based research tool interactive sites that are devoted to particular historic individuals. Anita Gonzalez is working with researchers at University of Michigan, undergrads and grads, to put together an interactive web-based resource having to do with the actor Ira Aldridge. And so they are collecting images and data and other kinds of materials to track down histories of Ira Aldridge, performance histories, biography. Naomi Stubbs, Amy Hughes, Scott Dexter, Shane Bro, and others are doing a similar project with the diary of Harry Watkins,
right.
This pre-Civil War actor, and that's a great website.
Their project in terms of like the metadata tagging of his diary and the sort of cultural context of colonial America, I think, is a really great example of this kind of interesting intersection of history, performance, culture, and also then technology, because they've got a really sophisticated kind of interface going, as I understand it. That's been a great project.
Yes, yes. So some of these places are great for researchers, students, undergrads, grads, established scholars who want to go in and learn about these famous theater people through something above and beyond looking to scholarly articles and books. But then there are other resources in which people can go in and produce things, like go into virtual theater sites that are created, and they can play around in those arenas and figure things out virtually that they wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to do on their own. And so I think of Jennifer Roberts Smith, who has the Simulated Environment for Theater Project, SET, and I think of David Saltz's National Science Foundation funded virtual vaudeville, and you know, these powerful sites that are able to create these whole virtual worlds that users can go in and play around in.
Well, and then there's Frank Hildy has the project of digitally reconstructing theater spaces, and Joanne Tompkins has also been doing a lot of that, particularly around the Elizabethan and Shakespearean era shows, right? So I think she's done a full digital reconstruction of The Swan, I want to say, and I'm sure that there are lots of others. So, I mean, because one of the emphasis of these conversations is thinking about theater and performance studies in graduate education, given these emerging resources, both as sites of scholarship, but also resources that people can draw on, as well as venues. Right, there's kind of two sides to this: things you can use, and then things you can also produce and contribute to.
Mm-hmm.
What's your, coming, and you were at Bowling Green State and deeply involved with graduate education there. Now you're at, University of Washington, and I would assume deeply involved with graduate education there. And thinking about the field, how do you see these developments affecting, graduate education? Is this something that we, because I'll go out on a limb here, I would say that most of us who are currently teaching the field, we're not trained in these techniques as part of our graduate study in theater and performance. A lot of what we've, the work that's been done is being done in collaboration, but it seems to me that the kind of next generations of theater scholars will have an interest, but also may be required in some ways to think about scholarship in these terms. And I'm just wondering how, given what you've looked at and what you've read and the conversations you've had, how do you see that playing out? Is this something that we should all be putting in our graduate programs? Is it something that you see a need for, that a few programs might be able to fill? Is this a supplement or a certificate program? I don't know. I mean, we could sort of talk broadly or about more of the practicalities, but how do you see this, what you've kind of drawn out in the white paper, affecting trends in graduate studies, and in particular, what should contemporary grads kind of be thinking about?
Yeah, those are all really good questions, and I would say to start with a broad answer, I do think that this is a very important thing to consider, and I think that all of our graduate programs in theater and performance ought to be thinking proactively about how they can incorporate training in digital scholarship into their existing curricula, or identify those resources on their campuses where the grad students can go and find what they need to be able to pursue digital scholarship. Because I mean, it's here, it's happening. One of the things we did when we put the recommendations together in the white paper, we made those recommendations available to our colleagues in ATHA and ASTR and invited them to respond along a set of questions. And one of the things we asked was, how many of you out there currently train your graduate students in digital technology and in digital research, encourage your students to think about non-print knowledge production. And what we found, we didn't get that big of a yield with the survey. I expect that the folks who were responding to the survey were people who already had digital scholarship on their mind and as a priority. But what we found, even those who did respond said that fewer than half of their programs included explicit training for their graduate students, even though some people volunteered that they assumed that everybody else was. So we are behind the curve. We are not keeping up with our colleagues in the sciences or some of the other humanities like communication, and so we need to get acclimated to this new world, and we need to figure out where those resources are. And I would say, you mentioned collaboration, and I think that's one of the biggest things in talking with members of our subcommittee and colleagues on campus. What I learned is that we really have to, as we move forward with thinking about knowledge production in theater and performance as both print and non-print, we need to de-emphasize, or at least rethink, our notion of scholarship as being solely produced. Mm-hmm. That's what we get that's how we get evaluated. That's what goes into our tenure and promotion files. That's what hiring criteria are all about. That's how we assess our grad students. You know, the capstone for a graduate program is a solo authored thesis or dissertation, and digital scholarship is hardly ever, in my very small experience, it's hardly ever all done alone. You have to find those resources. It benefits from a number of collaborators who bring in their own skills, and so that's one thing to tell grad students, is to find those collaborators on campus in programs.
It strikes me that there's a certain irony in the theater people being particularly or behind the curve in terms of our collaboration. When you think about sort of the longer history of our discipline and how it's come to be, I mean, no one would ever train a theater maker, well, I guess except in like very specific kind of solo performance contexts. But even then, I mean, even a solo performance artist is very rarely totally an individual, right? There's almost always some kind of collaborative team that engages in that. So I think it's always sort of amusing, this idea that in scholarship somehow we adhere to a model that has nothing or very little to do with our objects of study and to the training paths and interests that many of us pursued as a way into the discipline. So I'm I'll be very honest, I'm all for collaborative scholarship. I think, writing with others, even in the most conventional sense, is really beneficial. But I can also imagine a lot of, very legitimate concerns and objectives, objections to shifting or introducing this as a main part of them. I mean, one comes to mind, I think, in any training program. One of the first things that people are sort of confronted by is there's so much to cover. How do you cover it all in a reasonable, comprehensive way in the limited time without making like a double-digit year kind of program? Another is, does everybody need this? Might this crowd out the traditional archival, paper-based scholarship? And certainly, I, like many others, and you can see it in my webcam shot, and I see it in your webcam shot. Like many of us have an affection, borderline a fetishization for printed materials. But I'm wondering, like, what other, what are some of the other objections in terms of rigor, assessment, displacing the value of a single authored work and a sustained work. There's been some discussion about moving away from the monograph to articles, because they're, somewhat, one might argue more expedient, or, I mean, are we just kind of reverse engineering the market? I'm curious to hear you kind of, think through some of the objections, because I think there are some, obviously anytime you introduce something new, there's going to be a kind of knee-jerk reaction of, it's new, I don't want to do that, it's not what I was trained to do, it's not the way it should be. But I think, beyond that, there are some real concerns for how this will manifest and what it could mean for the discipline. And I'm just wondering if you, as part of the white paper process or in your own thinking about this or in conversations with other folks, have confronted some of those, and how do you address some of those objections?
Yeah, those are all objections that are out there, and I think that you're right. A lot of it has to do with an anxiety of, this is the way it's always been done. We don't want to change, but also a genuine lack of specific criteria, or a perceived lack of criteria to judge success in digital scholarship. The current paradigm for judging success in publishing is, you've got a number of solo authored articles, and eventually a book monograph or a published collection, and those articles come out in peer-reviewed journals, and those books are published by academic presses that have a recognizable imprimatur of excellence. And once you start thinking about work outside of a journal article and outside of a book, it's sometimes difficult to discern what one piece of digital scholarship is compared to another one. Who's vetting these things? Are they in any sense peer-reviewed in that sense of the word? When we don't have time necessarily to read each other's work in assessment, we look for those handy little recognizable identifiers that help us decide, I might not read or understand this, but I know it's been peer-reviewed. It's got the symbol of a known press on the cover.
Wow.
And there are answers to those questions, and with digital projects that are funded by NEH or NSF or other granting organizations, they have rigorous peer review processes in place to assess the proposals and the output. And so there are those kinds of standards for vetting. As I mentioned earlier, some of these academic presses are seeking ways and asking authors to help them think about ways to produce scholarship that the presses can endorse, help disseminate, and thus be able to put their name on it, and authors have that press's name. But in the cases where something doesn't have a fancy funder or is not connected to a reputable press, we've discussed in the committee about a way that our organizations like ATHA and ASTR can help identify and mark or badge some of those works as legitimate, and help out the people in our field be able to have a system by which to identify success.
Yeah.
So these are obstacles, but there are ways to approach solving them.
I think the idea, the idea of having something systematic and being able to think about peer review in a broader way, I mean, that just seems to me super useful and something that would be of great benefit. I mean, I was following somebody on social media, I think it was Robin Bernstein, who was talking about strategies for how to deal with the level of requests for various kinds of peer review, whether that's tenure and promotion cases or manuscript reviews and things like that. And it seems to me that we do when asked for a whole lot of these things, we have this kind of shortcut system. And I remember, I think it was MLA at some point had I don't know if it was a paper or a white paper, but somebody said, at what point did we substitute the academic presses as the determinants of tenure cases, right? Like, nobody has time to read the book, so you just look at who published the book, and it doesn't matter if it was a great book at a lesser press or a cruddy book at a really great press. It's like, oh, well, it was published by. And so I mean, this is just my own sort of opinion, but I think it would be hugely useful to have more innovative and maybe even more democratic systems of peer review, right? So that we have ways of really evaluating what are the ideas being discussed here, how is evidence being used, are the methodologies sound, do they yield in a way that gets away from some of our kind of traditional markers, without dismissing or like ignoring the significance of those. It seems to me that there's an opportunity to kind of rethink this in a holistic way that I think could be really hugely useful.
Yes, indeed, and I think we are in danger of falling into sort of a emperor's new clothes dilemma of just relying on what other people say is the truth without ever and being given permission to not necessarily go and spend time with those books, but just have the imprimatur be what is the arbiter of success. Well, another thing that came out of our conversations was that digital scholarship is also by nature very participatory, so that the people who are making the scholarship are getting input from a number of people in real time, and that for a lot of these pieces of scholarship, the users, the readers, can have space to comment, and in some cases change in sort of a Web 2.0 way, so that the peer review is much more alive and dynamic, and the peer review is in fact co-producing the excellence of the scholarship, and so being more, I guess the word is nimble, in figuring out how we in theater and performance can adapt and shift to these new modes of knowledge production, and get out of that rut of using the same old criteria, which are rapidly becoming obsolete.
It does occur to me, though, that one of the challenges in that scenario is the definition of peer. I mean, like because as we think about crowdsourcing and we think about collaboration, it seems to me that one of the challenges too is what constitutes a peer capable of peer review. So, given all of us have our areas of expertise and our specific skill sets, and I mean, I will say that as the further I go along in my career, the more aware I am of all the things I do not know and the skills that I do not possess. And so, as you start to get into these, collaborative, multi-layered, multi-dimensional projects, what is peer review? Like, who can evaluate, evaluate what? And are we going to need to start creating peer review teams where you have somebody who's capable of assessing the technical and technological methodologies at work, where someone else is able to analyze, different research methodologies and content, where maybe another person comes in an area of expertise. I mean, I really do, as enthusiastic as I am for all of this, and that I am, partly I do really think about it in terms of this question of who becomes the peer, and while I'm sympathetic to a certain logic of the wisdom of crowds, I think there are interesting exceptions and anomalies where the crowd turns out to be wrong or misguided in some kind of response. And so I think that question will become a really interesting one in the years going forward, as we where for a long time we could take peer review pretty much for granted. We assumed that anybody who had sort of made it at a certain point in the academy constituted, a jury of our peers. And now I think, particularly as the methods change and the platforms change, I wonder to what extent this notion of the peer will also have to change and potentially become much more dynamic and even more pluralist.
I think that's right, and I think that these next few years are going to be some of the hardest where we figure those things out. And I think that as more digital projects emerge, they are going to rely on a a small cohort of people that we know about to to step up and serve as those peer reviewers. And they're going to be people like you, Sarah, and they're going to be people like Nancy Friedland and Deb Kaplan and the folks who are doing work in digital scholarship and who are publishing and who are recognized. And so those you and others are going to be flooded with with invitations to peer review until we can start building up a sustained larger group of people that will graduate into peer status, unless we can think on our feet and figure out ways to change the notion of what we mean by peer review.
Well, and that, I have to say, is probably the strongest argument you've made for the necessity of training a lot of graduate students in this area very quickly, so that the sort of layer of us who are working in this do not become inundated too quickly. So I appreciate that. I'm wondering, though, we have at least a few viewers out there. If there are questions and comments that we want to take sort of from the floor. So if you're watching us live, now is the time to submit your questions. But as we're waiting for those to come in, I'll simply follow up with one of my sort of current, I don't know, dilemmas on this topic, which goes a little bit to what you were just saying, Scott. But is this question of how do we figure out what we don't know, and particularly thinking about it in terms of specific technologies. So one of the things, obviously, that you alluded to is this need to kind of go out throughout your campus and find people who can fill in the gaps. And there's a long history of research and scholarship following this model, right? I mean, we should be collaborating more than we are, but aside from sort of formal collaborations, we very often have all kinds of informal collaborations, right? Where we write to people we know and say, can you point me in the direction of this particular source? Or I'm working on this project, it's kind of similar to this thing that you did, who should I be reading? But then at a certain point we start to confront a little bit of a tension or a potential stumbling block when we get to the issue of the technology itself, right, and technical expertise. And I'm wondering if you could speak, in our kind of last couple of minutes here to, as part of this kind of training and thinking about these methods, to what extent do you see, a certain kind of technical expertise being required? And this is, I think, a kind of dangerous area, because I think this is what really starts to freak people out, right? When you start thinking, like, I want you to learn, Python instead of French, or I think you should know how to translate things into JavaScript, not into, not from ancient Greek into English. And this idea of suddenly, all of us having to acquire new skills and in new domains that we may or may not be suited to, that may or may not feel fun. I mean, I was just having a conversation this morning with a bunch of folks in robotics and computer science and electrical engineering, and we were talking about just how frustrating programming can be. Like that, coding. We were making little jokes about, we make T-shirts that say there is no crying in computer science, right? But in fact, there is lots of crying in computer science. There's lots of frustration, and so I think that the sort of areas of technical is both intimidating, and I think also feels, like, look, I've spent a career, or a lot of my graduate training, learning these particular skills, and now you're telling me on top of everything else I have to, learn HTML. Like, forget it. I'm like, why? So I think a lot of the resistance, understandably, comes from those domains as well. I'm just kind of curious, what have you heard? What's out there? Are there people who are doing training programs for graduate students in this area? How are they doing them? Is it just a matter of like matchmaking? Because sometimes it's hard to get the folks who are deeply invested in programming and computer science to also become interested in things like, the Watkins Journal and things like this. Although obviously in that instance not, but you know what I mean? Like just thinking about the practicalities, like how do you really engage with this? Can you talk about examples or or thoughts on how we might approach this as a practical matter for our students?
Certainly, yeah. I think you put a finger on the biggest anxiety of all, which is how do we go about getting for ourselves a technical expertise, and how do we even know what kind of questions to ask when the technical language just sometimes goes so over our head.
Sure.
And I think that institutions that are fortunate enough to have offices on campus that offer workshops. These can be offices within the sciences and computer sciences. I know at University of Washington, because of the Allen money, Microsoft money, we've got a lot of really great, wonderful buildings that I think are really intimidating for a lot of us in the arts and humanities. We don't even want to go in there. But a lot of these resources are also available through the libraries or through centers for teaching and learning that have staff whose job it is to help make those connections, help attach students and faculty to the resources there, and who will have speakers and have hopefully regular workshops. And so in the best case scenario, if a number of people in theater and performance get together and walk over to those offices and say, we are starting at square one, how can we start a conversation to start building our skill set and start learning about these things. I would say that other things we're seeing in our professional organizations is that a number of working groups are emerging, and so people can go to our professional conferences, 2 or 3 of them, or 4 of them a year, and seek out those working groups and those meetings where people are talking about their new projects, what they're working on, and the resources that they are using. And so there are networking opportunities that are happening, not just cross campus, but within our organizations.
I think that's really. I think that's a really good point. In part because I think, institutional change is perhaps sometimes the most difficult thing to affect. So if you are at a place like UW or CUNY, finding those resources may be relatively easy. If you're at other kinds of institutions that don't have that infrastructure, generating that can be, I think, hugely time-consuming, particularly if what you know is all the things you don't know. That trying to make the case for how to get these resources, particularly in times of declining budgets and many other things, can be really challenging. So I think that the professional organizations. I mean, I was so excited to see Atha and Aster, sponsor this subcommittee, because I think it really that's really what's going to serve for larger institutional change in the field, and certainly giving people a resource if they don't have that on their own campuses, I think is really hugely useful. And I think that there's some really practical things coming out of that, particularly taking advantage of online resources and online connections, because of course, attending 3 to 4 conferences or working groups a year could be, hugely time-consuming, but also really expensive depending on what part of the country you're in and where these are. So I think it's really exciting that this is happening, and hopefully we'll continue to see more. I think it also would make it really attractive and beneficial to graduate students in particular, I would think.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that what we are also doing is putting not putting pressure on our organizations, but really expecting our organizations to now put their money where their mouth is and to help incentivize digital scholarship, to not only expand the criteria for excellence in scholarship to include the digital, but also to create awards that will recognize and celebrate digital scholarship. And I also think that in the event where a particular institution does not have very many resources to foment and foster programs for digital scholarship, our organizations can help out with co-sponsored events money and help pay for a leader to come in and spread the goodness around. So as we move forward, I think we need to work together to identify those resources, take advantage of the resources that we know are out there, and keep talking to one another, and to use our regional meetups and our annual meetings to keep each other posted about what's going on.
And our chats.
And our chats.
Right? So I mean, so I think that's a great place for us to conclude. Scott, I want to thank you so much for chatting with me today. And just to remind folks about all of Scott's great scholarship, most recently Simming, right? This is the book that just came out, is that right?
Well, I got the advanced copies last week, so I think we're getting close.
Okay, so give me the full title. What is the full title?
It's called Simming: Participatory Performance and the Making of Meaning, and it's coming out from University of Michigan Press in the next couple weeks here.
Awesome. And you know that titles with colons are like cited 3 times as much as titles without colons. So good job getting at least 1 colon. I'm going for 4 colons in my next book title. Some of them organized perpendicularly to each other. Also, just a reminder, Scott Magelssen and Henry Weil are the editors of Theater Historiography Critical Interventions, which has an online companion site through the University of Michigan Press. That site is theaterhistoriography.org. And Scott, is that all one word, or is there a dash between theater and historiography?
There is a dash, and theater is spelled with an ER. So theater, historiography.org.
Okay.
But you should be able to find it with both spellings. If
you Google, I imagine, theaterhistoriography.org and/or Scott's name, you will find it relatively easily, and it's a great resource. I'm particularly fond of the faculty club, right, where people are sharing resources all the time. I want to thank you very much for chatting as part of UB Theater Grad Chat, and to remind everyone that we'll be back here in the fall talking about other issues of interest to graduate students in theater and performance studies. Also, we'll be focusing next fall on critical dance studies and the rise of the dance PhD, not to be confused with the great project Dance Your PhD, which is yet another fabulous digital methodology and intersection between the arts and sciences. For UB Grad Chat, I'm Sarah Bay-Cheng. Thanks a lot, Scott, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.